Now in JavaScript, you also have a concept which is called falsy and truthy values. Now we learned about false and true, which were these Boolean values. Now what's falsy and truthy? Is this like kind of a strange special extra data type? No, it's actually just how JavaScript under the hood evaluates conditions. Generally, JavaScript conditions work with Booleans, true or false, but they also work with these falsy or truthy values. Here's an example. Let's say you have a constant name input which holds a value of max. Here it's hard-coded into the code, but of course that could be fetched from an input field on the web page, let's say. And then we use this in a condition here where I compare the value in name input to the hard-coded value of max. Well, we know that name input stores max, and therefore this of course would work. To be precise, this condition yields true in this example here, so it yields a Boolean value, and therefore this of course works. That's what we saw thus far. Now consider this code snippet here. We again have name input which holds max, in this case hard-coded, but could be fetched from the input field on a web page. But now in the if condition, I don't compare name input to any concrete value, I just have if name input here. And this name input constant here, of course, holds a string, not a Boolean, right? We initialize it one line above it, so this holds a string, not a Boolean. And still this works. And this works because JavaScript tries to coerce values to a Boolean value if a Boolean is required, as it is the case in an if statement. So yes, if statements work with Booleans, but JavaScript tries to convert a value to a Boolean if it doesn't get a Boolean comparison and also not a Boolean itself. So for example, if you have a variable which you pass into an if condition, which you don't compare to anything, but you just say if that variable, and that variable holds a value of 0, then this will actually be treated as false. So 0 is treated as false in a condition. Any other number, including negative numbers on the other hand, are treated as true. So 0 is kind of a special case which JavaScript treats as false. Now when might this come in handy? Let's say you're doing some division and you don't want to divide by 0. Now let's say the value is provided by the user enters a value in the input, and you want to make sure that you don't divide by 0. Of course you could check if user input is equal to 0, and if it is, you return, or you just use the shortcut of just plugging in the variable name. And actually again, our calculator is a great example. It actually never makes sense in our calculator if the user enters 0 here. Adding 0, subtracting 0, or multiplying or dividing by 0 doesn't really make sense. You could say multiplying resets it, but let's say we don't want to have that case. And dividing would even be illegal. It's not allowed to divide by 0. So what we could do in the calculator here, in the calculate result function, besides checking our cases here, we could also make sure that we return if, and now we can actually use the OR operator here, if the entered number, and for that we just have to extract it before we run that code here. So if the entered number here is equal to 0. Of course we could do that. What this would now do is, it means we would return right away if either the calculation type is not add, not subtract, not multiply, and not divide, or if the entered number is 0. So let's test this. If we reload this page, of course, everything works here. But if I enter a 0 here, you see our output doesn't change down there. So that works. Now, again, we can do that, but we can also say if entered number, or to be precise, since this would be treated as true if it's anything but 0, we can add an exclamation mark in front of this. Now this might look strange at first, but what this says is if not entered number. You might remember that slide at the very bottom here, the exclamation mark operator, that's what we're using here. This negates a value and checks if it's not true. So in this case, entered number, if it's 0, is treated as false by JavaScript. It's falsy, and therefore by adding an exclamation mark in front of it, we kind of invert that value. We say if that's not the case, then we want to make it in here. Now, since 0, if the user entered 0, is treated as false, this means if not false, which is true, then execute this code. So if entered number is a falsy value, then not falsy will return true, And if we return true here, well, then we make it into this if block, and therefore we return from this function. We don't execute the function. If entered number is any other number but 0, including negative numbers, then it's truthy, and then with the exclamation mark in front of it, it's converted to false. So if false, we'll never execute the code in there, right? Because this code only executes if this first condition is true. And therefore, we don't make it in here, and we don't skip function execution by returning early. This is how this works, and this is the idea behind the truthy and falsy values. You don't always have to make an explicit comparison with the equal or greater than operators. You can also just throw in the variable or the value which you're interested in, and then just take this as a condition itself. And if it doesn't hold true or false, JavaScript tries to convert it to true or false. And there, 0 is treated as false, any other number is treated as true. Now for strings, an empty string is treated as false, any other string is treated as true. And for objects and arrays, it's important to understand that all objects and arrays, even empty ones, are always treated as true. So an empty object is not treated as false, it's always treated as true, no matter if there's data in it or not. Null, undefined, and not a number, by the way, are always treated as false. So these are the truthy and falsy values you can keep in mind. You can take that slide, it's attached, and kind of print it out and put it next to your desk. These are the special cases in JavaScript. If you just throw in a single value or just a variable with a value in it into an if condition without a comparison operator, so without the equal sign or the greater than operator, so just the variable like this, then JavaScript will look into the variable or look into the value, and if it's not true or false already, it will try to convert it to true or false, and this is how it then does it. Now that's it for our calculator and for the basics about if statements. Before we advance to loops, I'd say it's definitely time to work more with if statements to get a better feeling for them, for the comparison operators, for booleans, and for all these things which we used a bit here, but which is still brand new and therefore definitely needs more practice so that you feel confident using if statements in your code.